Welcome everyone to the session, Oil and Gas Transitions, Co-Creating Evidence to Accelerate Action. This relevant and timely dialogue is the first public event of the Oil and Gas Transitions Initiative, launched earlier this year by Climate Strategies and the Stockholm Environment Institute, working alongside world-leading research institutions from the UK, Norway, and Denmark. We are very excited to be hosting this event at the London Climate Action Week. A quick introduction of myself. My name is Borssén and I will be your host today. I'm from a non-profit organization called Highgrade Media. We publish video interviews and podcasts with experts and thought leaders on topics of natural resources and development. All our material is online, open access and free for everyone, so do check out what we do at highgrade.media. We have an eminent panel joining us today, and we will soon begin the roundtable discussion. But first, let me quickly go over some housekeeping. As always, in these online seminars, please keep your microphones muted if you're not speaking to keep distractions to a minimum. The session is being recorded and will be disseminated after the event to keep this important conversation going, so keep an eye out for that. After the roundtable discussion, there will be a Q&A section. So I would like to encourage you, our audience, to post your questions in the chat throughout the event, and we will pick up as many as possible during the Q&A portion. And now it's time to introduce our panelists. These are very accomplished researchers and policy experts, but I will keep their bios short to give room for the discussion. And you can, of course, find more details on the event page. First up is Andrzej Blachowicz, Managing Director at Climate Strategies, a leading organization working at the Climate Research Policy Interface. Previously, he served as cabinet member and advisor to the Polish Minister of Environment and has led relevant research dialogue on coal and just transitions. Andrzej, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you.
Hi, good to be here.
Next up is Gökçe Mete, Research Fellow at the Climate, Energy and Society Unit of the Stockholm Environment Institute. She is an energy sector expert and lawyer whose research focuses on supporting industry sector navigate their way towards sustainability. She leads the research program of the Oil and Gas Transitions. Gökçe, welcome.
Thank you, lovely to be here.
Then we have Navraj representing the University of Edinburgh team. Senior lecturer at Edinburgh Law School and head of the public law subject area. His research focuses on legal responses to climate change, often engaging with practitioners and covering interdisciplinary perspectives. Navraj, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here. Then we have Jordhus-Lier, representing the University of Oslo team, professor at the Department of Sociology and Human Geography. He is a political and economic geographer with a focus on organized labor, the politics of work, and social movements. David, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Åsa.
And Mathiesen, representing Aalborg University team, professor in energy planning and renewable energy system. His research focuses on technological and socio-economic transitions to renewable energy storage, large-scale renewable energy integration, and the design of 100% renewable energy systems. Brian, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Hello everybody.
I am going to start the roundtable now, and Andrzej, I'm going to turn to you first. As the name of the session suggests, we are here to consider the need for accelerating the transition away from oil and gas, which is also the focus of a program that Climate Strategies run together with the Stockholm Environment Institute, as I mentioned. Can I ask you to set the scene and tell us what this program is about?
Yeah, certainly, and thanks very much to everyone who is sort of on the panel, but above all to all the participants. Yeah, so and I wanted to start by acknowledging the support to this project by two philanthropic foundations, KR and Laudes. Thank you very much for supporting us. We are planning to work over the next nearly 2 years on those 3 countries, Denmark, UK and Norway. And we want to produce research-based evidence to be able to sketch pathways for oil and gas transitions in those countries. And, you know, we hope, first of all, it will help those 3 countries, but later on, we hope that it will formulate some useful recommendations, and we call them blueprints, for other oil and gas producing nations. One thing this is just to stress here is that the big feature of our initiative is that it's research-based, and it is meant to support all other initiatives, all other campaigns, decision makers in those countries and any other stakeholders with provision of this, you know, intelligence, insights, data, you know, and the hope is that it will drive the transition. So we are very excited to share this with you. And you know, this is also an invitation for you to contribute from day one.
And you have worked in the past on the question of transitioning away from coal, which I feel is more underway than the oil-gas question. Why would you say that the coal debate gained more momentum than oil and gas?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And we actually co-led a similar a project with a similar methodology 4 years ago that was focusing on 5 major coal-producing countries in the world. I think there are two issues. One is that at that point, like a few years ago, many coal transitions had already happened, many of them in very uncontrolled ways. So that's one thing. The other thing is the economics, you know, behind coal is really against that fuel, you know. So some of this was sort of happening by itself. There was just simply no economic rationale in continuing. And also, I think there is less maybe vested interest, right? Oil and gas is much more powerful sector globally. And I think that's why it's tricky. And also, I would say there is not, so oil and gas is the next frontier. So some work we did on coal, and I thought that work also inspired many more initiatives where, you know, when you look now, hundreds of people are working in coal transitions worldwide. And yeah, this is almost like a next frontier. And because so many economies are so heavily dependent on oil and gas, that's really a challenge. And we are starting with the 3 countries that are most progressive, and yet, you know, this is very challenging for them. And you know, when you look, there are so many other countries where oil and gas are playing very important role. That, you know, this will be a fascinating exercise to see whether we can really identify those feasible pathways.
What would you say, what are some of the key lessons that you learned from the coal work that you have done that you can now transfer into the oil and gas transitions project?
You know, I mean, I thought that, and I'm a former policymaker, as you kindly said in your introduction. So initially I was like, okay, can research do something? I was myself skeptical. But now I really believe that whenever there is such a like polarized or difficult discussion, I think when you start with provision of solid evidence with all actors at the table, then I think over a couple of years you can shift that, you know. So if this is the sort of the spectrum of the debate, we want to shift it a little bit here towards the more ambitious side. So we really, you know, and in coal case, it happened, you know, my country, Poland, 3 years ago, nobody thought it could be a phase out, and now there was a phase out agreed. So we think that by doing that, engaging people, you change the mindsets and you give people enough information that, you know, maybe they won't admit it in the meeting, they won't admit it this year, but in 3 years, they will move. That's the hope.
Gökçe, I'm going to turn to you next and look a little bit at this from a global perspective. On the one hand, there is this push to move away from oil and gas. But on the other hand, the world economy has been hit hard by COVID and hopes for cheap fuel to recover the economy. How do we work around these contrasting objectives?
Thank you, Elsa. And exactly, like the disconnect between oil and gas production and climate targets, combined with price volatility and job losses arising from COVID-19 pandemic, have brought the industry's future into question. And when we look at data, the production gap report finds that to be consistent with the Paris Agreement's ambition and to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, oil and gas production between 2020 and 2030 would need to fall annually by 4% and 3% respectively. Yet current production plans and forecasts predict an average annual increase of 2% over the same period. So these forecasts therefore suggest a widening gap between business as usual and climate consistent trajectories over the coming decades. And although major multilateral development banks have committed to 4 times more funding for clean energy projects than fossil fuels, COVID-19 recovery packages from the largest economies continue to favor fossil fuels over clean energy, and this further widens the production gap. At the same time, the recovery of global oil and gas supply in the medium term remains uncertain. Oil majors and national companies have cut their upstream capital spending due to the impact of the pandemic. And it does look like share of upstream investment of oil majors are shifting towards transition, while that of national oil companies remain focused on traditional strategies. And aside from addressing supply, the reduction of carbon emissions from oil and gas will also require demand reduction. The transport industry, buildings are key economic sectors where such reduction is most needed. And this will require significant measures, including higher efficiency, electric vehicles, behavioral changes, and additional policies to be successfully implemented. Now, when we look at progress at the global level, we do see a growing trend of countries committing to net zero. However, only a few of them have legislated these targets in place. So to answer your question also, we do believe the current policy window opened by COVID-19 pandemic is a unique opportunity for policymakers to bolster and accelerate oil and gas transitions, including considering how to effectively manage oil and gas phase out as part of the transition. But we are also aware that differences in the political landscape across regions means that post-pandemic recovery of oil and gas supply and demand will vary, and especially between OECD countries and emerging economies.
And as you mentioned, this transition away from oil and gas, it's a global issue. It affects everyone and everywhere. But the program focuses on the North Sea region. Why the North Sea region?
Indeed, also, managed transition is needed from oil and gas globally, and the North Sea will play an important role in the transition. This region is home to high-income oil and gas producing countries with the right financing landscape and technology to transition away from fossil fuels and the resources to do so in a just manner. So this contrasts with other regions of the world that have high dependence and lower institutional capacity, which will then require greater international support. And in the UK, Denmark and Norway, there are plans and actions focused on reducing emissions from oil and gas operations through process efficiency improvements and building low carbon capabilities, such as through hydrogen and CCS. However, oil and gas expansion plans remain in the UK and Norway, with only Denmark setting any ambition to phase out the industry. So this ambition gap between net zero oil and gas industry and industry phase out is the key issue that we aim to address. And indeed, despite signs of countries and regions starting to set deadlines for the phase out of oil and gas exploration and extraction, no major oil producing country has yet announced a moratorium or sunset on their activities. So actually the biggest producer with a phase out deadline is Denmark, and it actually ranked 45th biggest producer in the world in 2020. Even on a regional level, this is only a fraction of production compared to Norway, which ranked 13th, and the United Kingdom, which ranked 19th. This is why, we will not only, of course, the project focuses on the North Sea, but throughout the project, we will reach out to other oil and gas producing and importing countries around the world to share the lessons learned from the North Sea. This includes EU producing countries like Netherlands, Romania, and Italy, and non-producing countries. And to discuss how transition affects them, as the majority of Norway and UK's oil and gas is exported to the EU. Also, through the development of blueprints for oil and gas phase-out scenarios in the North Sea, the project will demonstrate that it is possible to have a just transition in other countries. This could be particularly influential in newer producer African states, for instance, where there are ample opportunities for renewables and hydrogen.
And we are going to look more in detail to each country and look at the case studies. But I wanted to ask you first, you mentioned just transition, and it is a concept that we hear a lot, but how would you define that? What is a just transition?
And that is a good question. Well, I'll refer to our publication. We have identified 7 steps for just transition. And this is our framing of the project. And we look at, we look at, of course, jobs, but also environmental impacts of oil and gas, and how transparently these policies are implemented, and how just how oil and gas transition plans take into account the protection of the workforce and the value of these resources in the economy and society. But we have a publication from SEI that is our central framing, and it has 7 steps of just transition. So that will be my recommendation for anybody who wants to know more about a good definition of just transition to read.
Excellent. Maybe we can drop that link in the chat for people to check out. Thank you, Gökçe. We are now moving on to looking specifically at what happens in the North Sea producing countries. But first, let me remind you to submit your questions in the chat function, and we will address as many as we can in the Q&A section. Navraj, I'm turning to you now. Only months before hosting the COP26, the UK government announced it was allowing more oil and gas drilling in the North Sea. Is this simply a case of money trumps the environment, or are there other reasons for this decision?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Yeah, I mean, there's a real incompatibility, isn't there, between, or an apparent incompatibility between the net zero ambitions of the United Kingdom and indeed, 70% of global GDP, which is currently under net zero commitments of some sort or the other, and the apparent desire to continue drilling for or exploring and extracting new oil and gas. And it's very unclear whether that can be done in a scientifically responsible way, in a way that is aligned with the Paris Agreement and its temperature target. So yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult circle to square. One of the ways in which the United Kingdom is trying to do that at a policy level was revealed earlier this year. Something called the North Sea Transition Deal was published by the United Kingdom government. And what that does is to try to ostensibly to change the way in which oil and gas is explored in the North Sea. So traditionally or rather since 2015, there's been something called MER, which is this thing called maximizing economic recovery. So it's the idea that we've got to get out as much value from the North Sea as possible. The new approach, in line with, well, ostensibly in line with net zero, is to say that that can only be done if new licensing will only be permitted if it's done in a way which meets some climate compatibility checkpoints. We don't know what those climate compatibility checkpoints are yet, but that's a key intervention point in the debate for the United Kingdom. And
is this a case of greenwashing, or do you think that that will actually lead to action?
It's difficult to say at this point. I mean, on the one hand, you would say, the United Kingdom has a really outstanding track record on decarbonising its economy in the last 12 years or so. Certainly in the power sector, the footprint of coal is practically zero. Renewables have gone from a very low base to a very high level. So the UK government would say, well, we've done this before and we're committed to doing it again. Having said that, as we all, I think everybody on this call will be familiar with the recent IEA report, which makes clear, which argues that there is either zero or practically zero scope in future scenarios for new oil and gas investments. So, managing that tension is a real challenge.
And you mentioned the coal transition that has already more or less happened in the UK. It has gone from coal use in electricity from 70% in the 1990s to about 3% today. What lessons can be transferred to the oil and gas sector, would you say?
Okay. I think there are a number of different lessons. One is that whilst the market plays a role and an important role, it doesn't happen just by the market. Governments can't step back and wait for this to happen, not least because of the urgency of the issue. Secondly, and following on from that, is that directed government policy is required. So the real breakthrough for the United Kingdom's coal transition and forcing coal out of the energy mix was the carbon price floor, which the people who follow this debate will be familiar with. And that made an enormous and almost instant or very swift impact. So policy has a huge role to play. I think a third element will be the issue of just transitions. So, this is not the first industrial transition that the United Kingdom has been through. If you look at coal or steel or shipbuilding, all of these are, major industrial transitions, all of which, I think it should be said, have been handled very poorly, have had extremely adverse impacts on communities. We see those enduring impacts on those communities, even though some of these transitions took place 2 or 3 or even more decades ago, and that there's a real read across between those affected communities and populist politics. So if you're following UK politics right now, today, you will know that there is a by-election coming up in which the populism is, really upending the way in which traditional voting patterns and affiliations have been taking place. So this is not merely a technological fix. This is not just, new kit, new engineering will solve the problem. There are real societal and value and values at stake here, which need to be resolved hand in glove with the technological problems.
Thank you very much. That is interesting, and I'm sure there will be questions in the chat for you. We are moving on to the next country. Experts call it the Norwegian paradox. Norway's ambition to be a climate change leader is at odds with its continued economic dependence on oil and gas. David, will Norway ever phase out its oil and gas industry, and what are the main challenges?
Well, the main challenge, of course, is as you say, our dependency on oil, which I think compares only to Russia in a European comparison, and which is unique in the way we are dependent on oil. So our dependency is woven into our economic and political life, but also, I think, into more cultural and social fabric. So we have, for years now, in our discourse, built up an understanding of a virtuous cycle between revenues, taxation from the oil and gas industry, the building up of our sovereign wealth fund, a relatively expansive welfare state, and also employment, which is directly and indirectly connected to petroleum. And I think this really permeates civil society. I think it permeates parliamentary politics. So it's very hard to rewrite a narrative in which you have been thinking about this reinforcing dynamic as a virtuous circle. And it has also, I think, afforded the Norwegian government the financial muscle to champion a kind of climate politics where you think about emissions reductions as something you can do via, quotas and building rainforest or growing rainforest elsewhere. So there is, like you say, there is a paradox here in the way we think about our oil policies and our climate policies. And I just like to add another, I think, often forgotten dimension of this dependency is that since 2000 we have had an emerging supply industry, an upstream supply industry to the petroleum complex. So that means that much more employment is now really built into this. And while the supply industry has green ambitions, like many other industries, and it wants to, I think it has a target of supplying 2/3 renewables in 2030, so in 9 years' time. At the moment, though, it's 90% dependent on the oil sector, oil and gas sector. So it's a market-sensitive industry, but if you start talking about the phase-out in the Norwegian context, and you think of it as a kind of rapid, abrupt shutting down of oil and gas extraction, it just crashes with the narrative that is built up within the industry, where that is thought of as a transition in several stages that starts with electrifying the offshore installations, which are kind of the main contributors, or at least the oil and gas industry contributes about 1/4 of the emissions domestically. So if that's electrified with electricity from land, then we will do a lot with our own emissions, but we will also kind of continue the life of the oil and gas industry. And then from that, I think the industry thinks of building new value chains where hydrocarbons are then fed into blue hydrogen, maybe, and where we develop carbon capture and storage. And then only after that are people in the industry thinking about shutting down extraction as such. So it's tricky, and it's really about, and this is what we're interested in the Norwegian country team, is to kind of explore how new narratives can emerge around what the transition can be.
And you did mention the sort of tricky political situation, and in fact, all the major political parties in Norway take a stance for more oil exploration and drilling. So what role do you see for Europe and European countries to try to sway them and change this position?
Hard to answer, because first, I think that we have this kind of schizophrenic policy where we have a very ambitious climate policy for our domestic market, but where we seem to continue to just cater for the production of oil and gas into the future, and that's paradoxical. And when you ask what Europe can do, I think what is Europe in this respect? Are we talking about different national governments or the European Union putting some kind of political pressure on Norway? I think that the ambitious goals that have been set by the EU have been very, I think they have inspired or pressured maybe the Norwegian government to make more ambitious goals. But when you talk to the industry, they think of Europe rather as a market. So it's more interesting to think about how the European market sends signals about whether or not they have a hunger for Norwegian hydrocarbons or not, or whether they are buyers of these new green value chains that, or maybe I shouldn't say green, but greener value chains that come out from the oil complex in terms of hydrogen or carbon capture and storage, or other ways or offshore wind, or other ways to explore, what is out there on the continental shelf in terms of technological and business opportunities.
And what would you say is a reasonable timeline for Norway? When will they have phased out oil and gas? And we're talking about hundreds of years. What would you say?
Again, referring to the industry, which I'm in contact with through my own research, I think that they envision continued production into, say, the 50s and 60s at the least. Although there is an acceptance that this will gradually decline, and it's already in declining. But only yesterday, the Norwegian government approved a project to produce a new site outside west of Stavanger, and that will produce until 2044. But again, it has to be profitable to continue producing this. So when you talk to the industry, they say as long as the market wants, which is a problematic stance, but that's also a way of looking at it. That's
the business case. Thank you, David, for that expose. We will move on to Brian. Last year, Denmark cancelled all new oil and gas permits and committed to end production in the North Sea by 2050. This will cost Denmark about £1.1 billion. A radical decision. How was this made possible? And would you say that the Danish case is replicable to other countries?
Well, it's really complicated question, and as a person who actually has contacts in all of the North Sea regions, it's also very evident that there are significant differences in the countries that we're touching upon here. And how is this possible? Well, first of all, it's a long process in the sense that we have debated energy and climate policies since the 70s, before climate was a part of energy policy. And since 2005-6 or something like that, there has been a goal of being based on 100% renewables of some sort. And that has then gradually merged into what we have today, which is a sort of what you call a radical decision, but in Denmark it's not really perceived as that radical. It's perceived as something we kind of have to do. But this cancellation of the permits, the new permits, is a remnant of this long process. But then within the last 2 years, the political situation, I think that everybody was aware that the last EU election was a climate election of some sort. There were many other things, of course, but climate was at least a significant part. And we did have what you call a national climate election here, which meant that we got a law, a climate law that says we have to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 70% before 2030. And then you could say these things that happens in the North Sea, they don't really count in that. I guess a lot of people know that, or maybe it's not public knowledge, but there's like an account for the country, and then there's another account for what's produced. And this is also what was said by David within the Norwegian debate. But that meant that it was kind of a pressure on the politicians to also deal with this. And of course, that's possible when it's a minor part of the economy, and when you can see that there are technical ways out of it, that we are going to reduce our own consumption. And also then you can see that there are a plentiful of jobs within the renewable energy and energy efficiency sectors. So in the Danish system, the oil and gas industry has not been that dominant in the sense that it has been possible to stop that. Of course, the industry have not been happy about it, and they have argued things like we are environmentally friendly, we have environmentally friendly production in the North Sea, and all of this kind of stuff, which is in my mind not really the case, but that was part of the process. I think right now you will see that this deadline will move forward. Probably there will be a pressure to end some of the existing extraction plants in the North Sea. I would expect that to happen.
Let's talk about alternatives. As the Danish government focuses on the implementation of the oil and gas phase out, what is the sector transitioning into, and how do you build a business case around that? Is it, for example, renewables, hydrogen, carbon capture storage?
So in my opinion, it's a bit of the wrong question, because in a sense you could say we have another focus right now, energy policy-wise. So there's a lot of things being implemented to phase out oil, coal, and natural gas. And those companies who want to be part of that, they will gradually find new business areas. And you also see it internationally. Like recently you saw how Total is changing their name to Total Energies. And there are many other examples of these big sort of traditional oil and gas companies also realizing, oh, maybe we have to have a little foot in this corner as well. I think to take those companies that are working with those areas in your hand and following and dragging them over to somewhere is not really what's happening. What's happening is that either you're part of the future or you're not a part of the future. And this is about designing the business models and designing the strategy so that you know this is the end date. Do you want to be part of what happens after that end date? Then you have to deal with that. And now in this project, that's what I hope that we're going to be able to discuss also for the UK and Norwegian case. How are we dealing with this? Because there's something about the demand for oil and gas that we need to touch upon more than what it is that we're going into. Just to touch upon one thing that you mentioned here, which of course is debated, which is this CCS issue, the carbon capture and storage, and also you mentioned hydrogen in that connection. And I didn't give this completely a lot of thought, but it's clear to me that a lot of these companies are fighting for what's called blue hydrogen and carbon capture to make clean oil and gas products. But what my opinion is about that, and what we see happening, is that these companies have had a chance to do that for decades. And they're not the companies who are leading that right now. It's other companies. It's companies coming more from the renewable sector who are leading the hydrogen and the carbon capture for the carbon capture utilization pathway, or the power to X pathway. It's more coming from that sector in what I see, but I might be wrong. So and that's of course why we have to also have these kind of projects to illuminate what are the solutions here.
Yeah, and maybe eventually one of the panelists want to pick up that. We'll see. Brian, thank you so much for talking us through the Danish case. We are going to move on to the Q&A section of the session now, and to kickstart, Ewan Graham, senior researcher at E3G, who is also working on oil and gas research, would like to ask a question to the panel. Ewan, please unmute your microphone and turn on your video. You are already here, and I will hand over to you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, it's been a really fascinating discussion to learn more about the different dynamics in kind of different countries in the North Sea. I think E3G is doing work around the political economy of the energy transition in the UK, with a particular focus on upstream oil and gas. And I think something that we've kind of found from our analysis is that it really feels that for the UK government to shift their domestic policy, there's sort of almost like three conditions. Maybe it would need to be seen as both beneficial but also feasible for the UK to do. And then I guess maybe likely also that there might need to be seen to be a political cost to not doing so. And so I guess my question to the panelists is, from your perspectives, what research or coalitions are needed to kind of make this case successfully over the next couple of years?
Andrzej, maybe you want to start answering that question, and then maybe Navraj as well.
Well, it's a very, very good one. But, you know, our approach here on that journey for the next year and a half. And Navraj, you can sort of, as our UK lead, can maybe confirm or not, is basically to start building that community. And I think our approach is also to bring everybody on board. And I think that is really crucial. So, our attempt is to have also the license holders and just trying to invite them on the journey. I know some people say it's impossible. And I think we want to invite them to the conversation, listen to them, and, we hope we can show enough arguments and co-design that with them. And I think it will appear initially, as I said, maybe not ambitious enough to some groups, but so be it. We believe in this strategy. So I think this is our approach to see for the next year. And that's why, for instance, the COP, it is a milestone, but we are not putting all our energy only on the COP, right? As a momentum, we know that this is something that needs to happen. There is also a future after the COP, right? So our sort of approach is a bit more longer term.
Yeah. Just very briefly. Ewan, thank you for that question. I think one of the issues that I think one has to grasp when you're dealing in this area is just the gap between where the climate community is on this question and where the oil and gas community is right now. And if you're not in the habit of speaking to the oil and gas community, you'd be astonished, right? So there is such a gap as to, the idea that business as usual has to shift has not been fully taken on board or even partially taken on board. Making 5% of your capex on renewables is seen as, really path leading global, high performance, and, from from the perspective of climate researchers or climate campaigners, that has a very different flavor. So I think I would endorse what Andrzej just said, that I think the tent has to be opened up so that some of the research perspectives which climate researchers have are shared more broadly with the oil and gas sector, because I think there's a real gap as to what the requirements of the science are right now, as extraordinary as that may sound.
Thank you for that answer, and thank you very much for the question. We have another question coming in from the audience, Laurie Vanderberg from Oil Change International. I think, Tim, if we can let her in, we can let her turn on the microphone and camera and ask it live, so to say.
Yes, hi. Thanks all for the excellent presentations. If it's okay, I'm going to stay off video because I'm suffering from the flu. I wanted to ask what your thinking is on the extent to which governments in the North Sea region can cooperate on a joint agenda for phasing out oil and gas production in a managed and also equitable way. Over recent years, we've seen a sort of race to the bottom when it comes to the taxation of the oil and gas industry. The North Sea countries really competing with each other to attract interest from the industry to invest in new oil and gas production. How can we make sure that governments instead start to work together and engage in a sort of race to the top when it comes to a managed and equitable phase out of oil and gas production?
Thank you, Laurie. David, would you want to start answering that question?
I can try, but I feel like Laurie's question is a really important one that I'm not really in the position to answer thoroughly and in terms of how politically it can be done. But it has to, I can just say that when we talk, I mean, our discussions with people in the industry, and we're particularly talking about with workers and trade unions, they are constantly referring to this comparative element. If we do this, we will lose out. Therefore, I think that it's an excellent suggestion that the more coordination around this particular region, where there is a real and competition in geographical proximity, I think would be key to take out this argument that is so strong in the industry. But if you will allow me also, I would comment on Ewan's question as well, which I thought was really good. And I really agree with Navraj in just underlining this distance between the industry narrative and the climate narrative. And the question is, who is the industry? Because a lot of the environmental organizations and parties in Norway has really framed the industry as like one lobby and had a very stark rhetoric against the oil lobby. And I think that much of that is warranted, but the effect that it has, I think, has not been predicted well enough, because that has really created almost a populist backlash, which ties in the trade unions, which ties in many local, regional political actors into a resistance against some of these the ways that the phase-out arguments are framed, like, for instance, an end date that has been proposed by the environmental Green Party and so on. So this distance needs to be built, and it can only be bridged through alliance building. So that's why we, on our side, are trying to cater a dialogue between particularly the labor movement and the environmental movement to try to shift the initiative in who lays the premises in policy making and decision making here.
Gökçe, going back to Laura's question about race to the top, it's an expression that I like. What's your experience in countries working together in coalitions to promote that?
Well, from the oil and gas sector, I mean, we've looked at a number of countries. They may have not necessarily worked together, but there are already a number of countries, Spain, Ireland, New Zealand, who have put moratoriums, or Scotland on shale gas, on oil and gas. So I guess there's definitely room for building a coalition on oil and gas transition. I think this is missing. I think we've had that sort of engagement quite evidently from the Coal Beyond Plus initiatives. So we have seen that happen in the coal sector, and I think sort of intergovernmental coalition is missing. And we know that, for instance, when we were sort of looking to find an avenue at COP26 and see who's doing what, I found out that there's race to zero dialogues, where you have leading companies as well being part of that, and there was no oil company, there's no oil and gas company even being included, accepted to the race to zero dialogues. So I guess conceptually there's still a long way, but as Andrzej said, oil and gas is the next frontier. So coalitions will emerge. I have experience from industry transition, and I'm seeing that coalitions emerge also in transitioning heavy industries. So I suppose perhaps our project will also bring in that thinking a little bit more, especially in the region. I think it's much easier to achieve that within a region as the North Sea.
Excellent. If there anyone else in the panel want to tackle that, just give me a wink. But yes, Jan, let's go to you as well.
Yeah, I think there's this thing about what is perceived within the oil and gas industry is a bit important also to understand what is going to work. Now, in my experience, there's really a lot of group thinking in the oil and gas industry. Probably there is for me as well, and for some of you, but at least we're working with several different technologies. But in general, the perception of the problem is really lacking, and the urgency of the problem is really lacking. And this is what I think we need to take into account when we talk about policies as well. Is this like a nice nudging type of policy that is going to work, or is it something a bit more consequential, you could say? And in my experience, money talks, and I think that the oil and gas industry is really afraid when we talk at least about the global scale. And you also see that they're working quite a lot to build new pathways for oil and gas, into the plastic industry and materials, and trying to upscale so that those amount of oil that they're going to lose in the transport sector, because they do see the painting on the wall, that's going to be replaced by a material consumption. I think it's really a matter of also trying to make the industry understand that, and I think it's going to break up in that moment where the demand starts to fall, and you already see now that the ability to finance new projects is really actually not very good. It might be in some countries, but there are many places around the world where it's really hard to do that. But then when we zoom in on the North Sea region, so there's a global issue about oil and gas, and there's a European issue, and there's a North Sea issue. And a North Sea issue is that we here have we have the issue that we need oil and gas in Europe, but we also have the issue that we don't have the cheapest oil and gas in the North Sea compared to even to Russia. And of course, there's a merit order curve here on the cost side, and then there's a geopolitical issue on the other side. So that's also something I think we have to be aware of and take into account, that even if we impose some kind of radical decisions here, that there's the balance between the geopolitical side and the cost side, and when we start to do the changes.
Thank you, and thank you, Laurie, for the question. Hope you feel better soon. We have another question from Tom Harrison, Program Manager at the Global Gas and Oil Network. He says, the UNEP Production Gap Report has shown we need to phase out oil and gas production worldwide. Research has found that, compared to other producing nations, the North Sea countries have the highest capacity to transition off oil and gas. This would imply the UK, Norway, and Denmark should be phasing out much faster than the average global decline rates would imply. Question is, how should policymakers think about their responsibility to act more quickly than others? Any takers on that question?
Sorry, could you repeat that last bit? Policymakers should?
How should policymakers think about their responsibility to act more quickly than others? Yes, please go ahead, Navraj.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I mean, one aspect of that is that there's obviously a capacity, or a capabilities rather, approach to this, which is highlighted in the question. But if this is purely a matter of production, then of course there's every possibility, and indeed every likelihood, that production will just be met from somewhere else. Very likely somewhere else with lower ESG standards, health and safety standards, broader environmental standards than the North Sea production. So that form of displacement, I think, is entirely counterproductive. I think the real challenge there is demand management. And demand management is, it's not really something that we've discussed today, but demand management is a much deeper industrial and social challenge which needs attention.
Excellent. Gökçe, you were nodding vigorously.
Because exactly, I mean, great colleagues of mine from SCI who are some of the authors of the Production Gap Report, and that's what their, I guess, central messages, and they've delivered that to the UK as well. And that demand, especially in the North Sea region, where we see demand already falling. So it's important to sort of align the production, the rate of demand reduction with production rate. If they can go in tandem, then we could address some of that questions that we get as a response when we raise these issues, that but we would, if we don't produce, we would import the oil and gas.
Andrzej, you wanted to jump in as well.
Yeah, I think just a very, very brief reflection on this, how we can make policymakers. And actually, you know, the policymakers are the primary sort of recipients of this program. Mm-hmm. And I think I may sound like a broken record, but this wide range of stakeholders, once we are able to prove that, you know, we engage with them and there is a solution or a set of solutions, I think that will also enable policymakers to be braver, right? Because knowing, for those of you who were, maybe some in the audience used to be policymakers like myself, you can't just move because you just think it's right? You have all the constituencies, right, in the political constellation. So at least if you have some sort of warranty that there is a dialogue ongoing, I think then that will allow you to be a bit more ambitious. So this is the kind of what we hope to achieve.
Great. We have another question here from Khabib Negmatulev. Apologies for poor pronunciation there, but the question is, do you foresee hydrogen play any role or impact in the phase out of oil and gas in the short and long term, particularly in the North Sea countries as well as globally? Let's see who is inclined to answer this question. Gökçe, I know that you
try also.
Yeah, please, David, go ahead. Otherwise, I'll jump on Gökçe.
Yeah, sorry. It's not it's only a partial answer, but what I can say is that if you ask Equinor, which is the partially state-owned Norwegian oil giant and one of the, you know, really sizable multinational corporations, if you ask them, and when they give their presentations, blue hydrogen is like a central tenet in their storytelling and maybe also in their strategic plan. But I'm not sure what that, you know, to what extent that is a realistic target, because it's not something that can only be done by a company. It is something that needs to be, like Navraj was pointing towards in the chat here, that there needs to be a shared infrastructure, and yeah, there needs to be a balancing of supply and demand and so on and so forth. But at least in their own storytelling, that's the central tenet for them.
Gökçe, I do want to put you a little bit on the spot because you have a network called Women in Green Hydrogen. So if you want to promote that, but I also am very interested in your answer to this question. What role, or if any, will hydrogen play in the phase out in the North Sea region?
I guess absolutely. Like one aspect is demand. So we see that hydrogen is likely to replace especially industrial demand of oil and gas, replacing natural gas in like iron making, steel making, perhaps in cement and concrete and plastics and so on. So it definitely will have an impact on that, have a role in decarbonizing industrial clusters, but also for jobs as well. Indeed, whatever colors, but we see that that hydrogen has become actually the missing link for a phase out of oil and gas, because when we look at hard to abate sectors, there's no alternative. You don't have such high heat. So if you can produce hydrogen from green sources, renewable sources, CO2 neutral hydrogen, definitely it is the missing link. So it will help accelerate, and we are seeing that, and I think it has already started.
I don't see any further hands, so I'm going to move on to the next question we have from Richard Folland, Senior Policy and Government Affairs Advisor at Carbon Tracker, and he also works for Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative on European and stakeholder political engagement. And his question is, we are developing a global registry of fossil fuel reserves and production, the first of its kind to bring all this information together in the public domain. How important can greater transparency and government accountability be in terms of driving policy change among the producers in the North Sea? Andrzej, transparency and accountability, what would you say? How important is that?
Well, if I may, I think Navraj wanted to say something. I mean, I think just to say that the question is almost like it's has an answer in the question, in the sense that I think any more information that we have will, I think, bring. We know that we already said that, right? That we think once the data are on the table, I think it will be more obvious that there is a case for that. So I think that's just I think I can only support it. But Navraj, I think it's wanted to react.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, everybody's in favor of transparency and more data. I think you've got to be very careful in assuming that transparency axiomatically leads to your preferred outcome. One sees this very clearly, to take another example from in current climate debates, one sees this very clearly in TCFD reporting. The idea that if you reveal your climate risks, then your investors will respond like the rational economists or the rational actors of blackboard economics. That doesn't happen. We know that's not the way that investors work. So I think one needs to be very careful about the burden or the weight of expectation that one puts on transparency. Much more needs to be done.
But maybe, also if I may, I think the issue here is, I think if there is no data available at all, I think that's bad. But I think, Navraj, what you're saying is that we need more, but maybe not necessarily to make everything public, right, initially. So
what I'm saying is that don't assume that transparency will lead you to the promised land. You need to do much more than that. It's a necessary minimum, but that's all it is.
It's not a silver bullet, it's the start. A question, and we kind of touched upon it, but resistance to phasing out oil and gas relates to fear socioeconomic impacts. How, in your view, can large producers mitigate such negative impacts from a policy perspective, first and foremost? Bian, I feel like this would be part of your expertise. Would you want to take that, Bian?
Sorry, yeah. Well, I think that it's we need to connect these transition strategies to other things than climate, in my opinion, and I think we have a bit of. I was talking about groupthink in the oil and gas industry before. We also need to be careful that energy policy and these changes are not only about climate, because I do believe that we have an urgent situation that we need to deal with, but it's not perceived like that from everybody. So we need to also illuminate what are the other advantages of making such changes. And this is why when I talk about energy policies, I don't mention climate in every sentence. I mention a lot of things that are positive, like air pollution, job creation, new businesses, innovation, local distributed energy production, local engagement, engaging people. So I think it's not all a technological issue. It's also about showing that we have pathways where we can get out of the climate crisis, combined with creating a lot of jobs and a lot of new security here.
Let's see, Andrzej, you raised your hand here.
So just now one thing to add, because you brought the issue of sort of the role of the companies, and I know this is completely different scale comparing it to coal, but there is the truth in the fact that a functioning enterprise, a functioning business with cash flow, has the potential to use the money in some sort of new direction, right? So because it's a trivial thing to say that there is money needed, but I think those companies, we need them on board, right? Otherwise, the government cannot fund everything, right? So once the new kind of business models are found, the cash can be kind of directed in the new direction. Of course, it won't happen sort of from 100 to 0, but portions of the operation should kind of go to the new technologies or new developments, right? And I think that's the only way.
David, you spoke about how important the oil and gas sector is in Norway in terms of employment. What policies would you like to see put in place for the transition to mitigate negative impacts on the labor force?
Okay, so I think we are currently at a crossroads in Norway where there are, roughly speaking, two different ways forward that are being outlined, and one is very much in line. Like, it starts with the Paris targets. It's about how we can cut emissions. It talks about the phase out very openly and candidly. The other is much more concerned. It starts with the employment, and any kind of talk that starts from that discourse, I think, is calling for an industrial plan. So that is, I think, what the industry, and not, when I say the industry now, I'm talking about the workers and their union representatives. What they feel is lacking is a much more ambitious green industrial plan that takes the competencies, the employment, the regional economies seriously, and not just, implies that they are a problem that we need to phase out, but that tries to build on them. And this is a much used analogy, is how the maritime and fishing industry kind of enabled the oil industry in the 60s and 70s. And so they want to build on this industry and take and use government money, government investment in a very different way and at the ambition level that we don't see now, to build a national green industry. But I think that raises a couple of new dilemmas. For instance, there's a lot of discussion about whether we should ship, or not ship, but send our electricity via cables to the European market, or whether we should keep them for ourselves to build, to export the same electricity in the form of industrial exports, for instance. So all this talk about, coordination across national boundaries, it's not an easy exercise, because it really depends on what kind of path you're taking forward. And this industrial path, I think, is probably the one that could unite a lot of constituencies that currently are threatening to upend the mainstream climate politics. And we have an election coming up where these issues are really being discussed at the moment. So exciting times.
Interesting. The Q&A is about to round up, but Navraj, I'm going to leave the final word to you.
Well, if it's the final word. Well, one of the final words I'd just like to make is that for David, Brian and myself, we're all representing larger research teams, and I think we should acknowledge that, and thanks to all of those who have worked so far with us. The substantive point I wanted to make was really to build on what David was saying about the range of transferable skills and skill interoperability amongst from oil and gas to offshore and hydrogen and other sectors. These are, in writ large, we know this, right? Operationalizing it is really complicated, detailed work that requires, committed work on behalf of governments and industry, trade unions, regulators, skills organizations, skills providers, and that's just a very nitty-gritty example that can be replicated scores, if not hundreds of times across this area. There's a lot of very detailed work that has to be done to make the sort of transition that we're talking about viable for workers, for industry, and for governments.
Thank you. And there will be another final word from each of the panelists. I will pose just a final question to all of you, and if I may ask for just a 1-minute answer. And the question is, starting later this year, the next step for the Oil and Gas Transitions Programme will be to co-produce feasible just transition pathways to 2050 for the oil and gas sector in the UK, Norway, Denmark. But what about the short term? Here is the final question. Based on your research so far, what are the key priorities or sensitive intervention points to look at our pathway to COP26? Andrzej, let me start with you.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we don't want to neglect the short term, of course. So one thing is we want to start engaging with people from the beginning, which is, I think, quite innovative for so heavy research-based initiatives. We want to bring a little bit more attention to the oil and gas, at the COP, because that is not sort of an official agenda of the COP presidency. So we want to create more sort of attention to the subject. And as you heard sort of other initiatives even asking questions here, there are probably around 10 various initiatives around oil and gas transition. So we want to interact with them and make sure there's no overlap, and make sure we inject the evidence to their work, right? So that their work can be more effective. So this is actually something that in the coming months we want to do as this program. And of course, yeah, the one thing that this is, I'm adding it sort of outside of the script, which is basically, we hope to also invite some other countries to maybe start engaging with us, because that's the sort of the next frontier, which will be countries elsewhere, right? And especially the middle and low income economies, so we want to just let them know that this is happening, and that the next stage would be, engaging and listening to them and trying to maybe solve their problems.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gökçe?
Thanks also, and great last point, Andrzej, fully agree. I suppose from our side, we are still, there are many intervention points, and I'll let national teams to revert on those. But we also continue to look at sort of global trends, what is happening in other countries. So for instance, we have this new Net Zero Alliance just launched. So we're still trying to understand where the net zero oil and gas industry concept is going. We also want to know where globally just transition is, how it is evolving. Now we have this people-centered, what is the name? People-centered commission, I suppose, launched under the IEA with Denmark also in the lead. So we want to also know where the just transition concept globally is moving, and how those kind of pressure points impact the North Sea. So we're looking at the landscape, so to speak. At the same time, we'll be also following quite closely the EU policies on demand side. That will also have a huge impact on, again, how the oil and gas transition narrative is evolving in the North Sea. So these are kind of the big picture observations that will be in the short run following, perhaps not so much influencing immediately, but will definitely be engaging in those processes.
Thank you. Navraj.
Okay, so I think one of the, so something that we've not discussed is something that's happening out there in the real world, which is the mergers and acquisition boom for oil fields right now. And that's happening globally, but also in the North Sea. And we're seeing a real shift in patterns of ownership from oil majors and oil super majors to independents. And this radically changes the intervention, certainly speaking as a lawyer, this radically changes the intervention points that present themselves because of the nature of the independents. They tend to be unlisted rather than listed. They tend to be funded by private equity rather than mainstream finance. And so their approach to decarbonization is likely to be very different and even less sympathetic than that of the majors, oil majors, and national oil companies. So let's not let's just be aware of the scale of the challenge.
Excellent. David?
Well, yeah, I agree that the short term is very important, but the question is also, where do those short-term battles play out? And Navraj mentioned the gap between the climate and the oil and gas community, but there's also sometimes when you're delved into the research in the industry, that you also sometimes feel that there's a gap between what goes on in the kind of multilateral, transnational dialogues around commitments and targets on the one hand, and the very direct operationalized decisions that need to be made at a more national, regional, and even local scale. So what I hope for coming out of the COP is that that the Norwegian industry really feels a renewed sense of urgency, so that there's less debate about whether or when, to transition, and much more a kind of forced, urgent discussion about what to do now. And entering into operationalized mode. So that would be my hope.
Thank you. And last but not least, Jan.
Thank you very much. I think the most important thing for me to highlight is that if we can make like pathways to transition from the oil gas within the countries, that can be part of sparking a debate about how that climate policies are possible to do. And in those countries like Norway and also some extent Great Britain, where the oil and gas industry is rather large, then we need to, of course, look at the employment and the different re-educational principles. But I believe the real intervention is to show not only within the North Sea countries, but show globally that we mean business. And that means that the products that we demand, all of the embedded oil and gas that is in the products that we're buying as consumers, that our governments are starting to demand that this has to be climate neutral, or which is actually a bad word, sorry, like without fossil fuels at all, because this is what can actually spark also a global demand for this. Let me give you one example. It could be that I know, for example, Maersk, they have the equivalent of CO2 emissions of the country of Denmark if you take the entire fleet. But I also have great communication with them, and that they're actually working quite a lot on having a renewable energy-based fleet, because large companies are requiring that, because their consumers are requiring that. So if we start to get that into the national legislation, we have a supply chain demand for making this change. And then those oil and gas companies that are in Denmark, in the UK, and in Norway will feel the heat in a completely new way. And that's a short-term signal we can send, actually, if we start to develop that signal from the countries.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all panelists in a very excellent panel. I truly enjoyed this discussion. This session is now coming to an end, but the Oil and Gas Transitions Program, as we heard, is just getting started. As I mentioned in the beginning, the session was recorded and will be available online shortly, so feel free to share it to a colleague that might not have been able to attend, or in your network more generally, because we need to continue this important conversation. Thank you very much for attending, and we hope to see you soon again.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.